One of the all-encompassing important topics that we are going to look at this week is how are we shaped? In other words, how is our personality and how are our behaviors shaped? There's a number of different theories that attempt to explain this, so we're going to look at a few of them. One way that we are shaped is through biology or nature. This includes our genes and our brain processes. We now know that it's not just biology or nature that shapes us into the people that we become, but it's both nature and nurture. It's the combination of both nature, which is our biology, our genes, our brain processes, and nurture, which is the environment, such as our culture, our family, our peers, teachers, etc., that shape us into the people we become. These ingredients combined contribute to our unique personality and behaviors. So, just how exactly can nurture shape our traits and behaviors? So, one way that we're shaped through nurture or through the environment is via associative learning. And there's two types of associative learning: operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Operant conditioning was identified by B.F. Skinner, and he noticed that we learn via rewards and consequences. And these occur through three different techniques: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. So with positive reinforcement, we are strengthening a behavior by adding a reward, something positive. This could include money, toys, high fives, praise, clapping. And these are designed to strengthen a behavior. For instance, when you study hard for a test and you get an A, you're getting positively reinforced for working hard. So that's going to encourage you to study hard in the future. Similarly, when we go to work, we get a paycheck. So we are positively reinforced for working. When we are potty training our child, we might give him or her stickers or candy for going potty in the toilet. So we are strengthening the behavior of pottying in the toilet by giving rewards. Now, positive reinforcement can also occur with bad behaviors. For instance, some of you might have seen a parent, or you might have been the parent, that has inadvertently rewarded a child for having a temper tantrum. This occurs when we give in to the child's demands. For instance, if he or she is screaming at the grocery store because he or she wants some candy, and we give him or her the candy, we are actually rewarding the bad behavior. So now the child knows that if he or she screams and yells, he or she is going to get his or her way. So that is another way that we use positive reinforcement. So what is negative reinforcement? Negative reinforcement is often confused with punishment, but they're really two totally different techniques. With negative reinforcement, we are engaging in a behavior to eliminate or avoid something negative or unpleasant. For instance, we might drive the speed limit so we can avoid getting a speeding ticket. We might put on sunscreen to avoid getting a sunburn. So remember, with negative reinforcement, we are engaging in a behavior, so that behavior is strengthened because it helps us avoid or remove something negative. With punishment, on the other hand, we are adding something negative or unpleasant to weaken a behavior. For instance, we might give a child timeout for lying. So by giving timeout, we are adding something unpleasant in the attempt to decrease the bad behavior. If a teenager sneaks out of the house, we might ground him or her, or we might take away his or her cell phone. That is a form of punishment. Again, we are adding something negative or unpleasant to decrease a behavior. So now let's look at the second associative learning technique. This is called classical conditioning. And classical conditioning was observed by Ivan Pavlov. Many of you might remember his dog experiments with the drooling dogs. So what he found was that people learn instinctually, involuntarily. So classical conditioning is different from operant conditioning in the sense that with classical conditioning, it's involuntary. There's no rewards or consequences. It's just more of an instinctual, reflexive response. For instance, when my doorbell rings, my heart starts beating fast. That's a classically conditioned response. Many of our fears are classically conditioned. For instance, if you got bit by a dog when you were younger, and 20 years later, you still become anxious and afraid in the presence of dogs, it's because you were classically conditioned to be afraid of the dogs, afraid of all dogs. So many of you might remember the story and the experiment with little baby Albert. So in this experiment, a baby was trained to, he was actually classically conditioned to be afraid of cute little cuddly bunny rabbits. And the researcher did this by initially pairing the bunny rabbit with a loud, scary noise. So of course, when the baby heard the noise, he became frightened. Eventually, he associated that loud noise with the bunny rabbit, so he became afraid of the bunny rabbit. Even when the loud noise was no longer sounded, he still was afraid of the bunny rabbit. So even taste aversion can be learned through classical conditioning. For instance, years ago when I was pregnant, I had morning sickness, but I was also craving Taco Bell. So I would eat Taco Bell every day. And one day in particular, I became very nauseous. with morning sickness after eating Taco Bell. And you know what happens after that. So to this day, I cannot eat Taco Bell. And it's been 20 years. But still, when I think of Taco Bell, I get nauseous. So that's an example of classical conditioning. Our emotions, a lot of our emotions are learned through classical conditioning. So another way that we are shaped is through observational learning. This is also referred to as social learning theory or even modeling. And simply, it's just from observing the behaviors of those around us. For instance, you might have seen your mother become extremely angry and start throwing things. And because you observed her engaging in this behavior on a regular basis, you might do the same thing. You learned how to express your anger by throwing objects and yelling. Albert Bandura, he was the one that really first observed observational learning when he studied it in the lab. And he did this through a number of studies that with the Bobo doll. So what he did was he put children in a room with a Bobo doll. And an adult came into the room and started beating up the Bobo doll. When the adult left the room, what do you think happened? Well, in many cases, the child modeled that behavior. The child began beating up the Bobo doll. So from that experience and from those studies, Bandura deduced that many of our behaviors are learned through observation. Now, there are some issues with these Bobo doll experiences and experiments. One of them that is the fact that the Bobo doll was designed for children to pummel, to beat up. So it was advertised as a doll that we beat up. I mean, I remember back in the days, in the 70s, it was in all the catalogs, there would be a Bobo doll and a child punching it. So we knew that it was a doll that we were supposed to punch. I even had a Bobo doll, and I was really passive back then. I loved my Bobo doll, but it only took me about 2 days before the thing deflated. So that is called a confounding variable that could have interfered with the results of the study. These children already knew that that was an object to be pummeled. So that begs the question of, was it because they observed this adult pummeling the doll? Is that why they went and started beating up the Bobo doll? Or was it because they already knew that it was a toy designed to be beat up? So whatever the case, though, we do know that many of our behaviors are learned. Think about the behaviors that you learned as a child. What did you learn from observation, from observing your parents or those significant people in your life? Erik Erikson proposed the theory of psychosocial development. So this theory looked at how individuals develop through the interaction between themselves, biology, and the environment. And this theory has 8 stages, and it spans the entire lifetime. And it starts with the very first stage, which is called trust versus mistrust. And this stage is really the first year of life, which some believe is the most significant. And Erikson felt that in each stage, in each of these 8 stages, there's a task that must be completed. It's also called there's a conflict. So in that first stage, for instance, trust versus mistrust. So it's important that a baby learns how to trust in this stage. And they learn how to trust by the people in their environment. If they were held, if that adult in their environment, if their caregiver responded consistently to their needs with nurturing, affection, picked them up when they cried, then that child is more likely to develop trust instead of mistrust. And that has lifelong effects on the child. And creating that foundation of trust is of utmost importance for the next stage in life and for the stages that come after that. So in each stage, in fact, after that first stage of trust versus mistrust, there's autonomy versus shame and doubt. So think about how caregivers in the environment help that child become more autonomous, but also think about how adults might inadvertently or even purposefully develop a sense of shame and doubt in their child. So in that stage of around 2 to 3 years old, it's so important that we give positive reinforcement, that we praise that child, that we also give him or her the opportunity to make developmentally appropriate decisions. For instance, you might lay out 3 outfits from their closet. And give them the ability to choose, which outfit do you want to wear today? So this gives them that kind of illusion of control, but it also gives them the ability to make decisions within their age range and with what's appropriate. So obviously we don't want to give them a big decision. We don't want to tell them just, hey, go pick out whatever you want out of your closet, because you know what happens when we do that. It's overwhelming, and the child will come out with all different outfits on and a different pair of shoes on each foot. So anyway, so we really have to recognize how each stage makes a difference, but also how the previous stage and the ability to navigate or not navigate that previous stage will affect all the later stages. So be familiar with these stages and think about how you were able to navigate each one of these stages in your own life, and what effect did the environment have on you, and such as your caregivers, your friends, your school teachers. There's so many other important theories of development, and we're not going to go through them all, but here's a few of them. Adler's birth order theory, Piaget's theory of cognitive development, Kohlberg's stages of moral development, and Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. So what role do ACEs play in our development? ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. They can include anything from physical, sexual, emotional abuse, to the COVID pandemic, to poor attachments, insecure attachments with caregivers. They could include witnessing domestic violence in our homes, to even having a parent that was incarcerated or who suffered from mental illness or substance abuse. So if a child endures some of these ACEs, especially cumulative, the more ACEs, the greater effect they will have, or the more severe the ACE. So even one ACE can impact a child's life. And some of the short-term effects of those ACEs, especially those ACEs that aren't treated, when a child isn't treated or there's not those protective factors in place, then he or she might demonstrate symptoms. These symptoms could look like other disorders. For instance, sometimes in a child, we might see enuresis, which is bedwetting, nightmares. We might see some sorts of oppositional defiant behaviors, somatic complaints, and teenagers, we might begin to see other rebellious behaviors, academic struggles, eating disorders. there's a lot of short-term effects of these ACEs, but in the long term, what research has shown us is that ACEs are often the culprit or play a significant role in autoimmune disorders, cardiovascular disease, substance abuse. There's just a whole range of long-term effects, both psychological and physical, that are attributed to adverse childhood experiences. Now, how is our perception shaped? And why do we all have such different perceptions? In fact, nobody has the same reality. Think about that for a second. We might all observe a car accident, but each of us has a different perception of that car accident. Why is this? Why do we have different perceptions? Well, this goes back to our development. It goes back to our experiences. Nobody has the exact same experiences in life. We've all had different experiences. Those experiences, along with other factors in our environment, such as our religious beliefs, our culture, and our values, our family, all these things in our experience shape us. They shape our perception of the world. They shape what's called our worldview. Our worldview is the lens through which we see the world. Everything is filtered through that worldview. And that shapes how we see and think about things, which obviously the way we think about an event, a situation, or person affects how we feel, and then those emotions affect how we react or behave. So just remember, perception, everybody has a different perception, and it's shaped through our experiences.